This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Laurel S. Peterson. She is a community college English professor whose poetry has been published in many literary journals. She has 2 poetry chapbooks, That's the Way the Music Sounds, and Talking to the Mirror, as well as 2 full-length collections, Do You Expect Your Art to Answer and Daughter of Sky. She has also written 2 mystery novels, Shadow Notes and The Fallen. Laurel is on the editorial board of Inkwell magazine and the Norwalk Public Library Board. Laurel served as Norwalk's Poet Laureate from April 2016 to April 2019. You can learn more about her work at laurelpeterson.com, and her books are available on Amazon. Thank you, Laurel, for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Sandy. I'm delighted to be here.
It's an honor. And I have a family connection to Norwalk. My folks used to, in the 70s, keep a boat down there in one of the marinas back in the day. But I just love the town, and it's nice to talk to a professor who is a poet laureate emeritus from Norwalk. Would you tell us more about yourself as a poet?
I've been writing since middle school. That's when we all start, right? Because there's so much horrible angst in middle school. As a small child, I was desperate to read. I came home from kindergarten, I remember, totally upset that we weren't going to get to read that year, not until first grade. And so I guess after a while, one decides to try to do the thing, right, that one loves the most. And so I did. And I also think that writing is about figuring out what you're thinking and you're feeling. And so certainly as an early writer, right, there's a lot of exploration of who am I and what does this mean? And maybe that what does it mean stuff never really goes away. But I'm finding that I'm coming to be less interested in writing that's only about the writer. Certainly for anyone who's listening out there who's submitting to magazines, when I read for Inkwell, I think about, how much is this about the writer themselves, and how much is this about the writer and how that writer connects to the wider world and those issues and concerns. And so those are things that I'm trying to do in my own work at this point, however successfully or unsuccessfully. I want it to connect me to something bigger, right? The natural world, the human community, the stars, whatever. And so that's pushed me to step a little bit into persona poetry, which has been really fun, and to do more project-focused work.
That's interesting what you say about poetry that goes beyond the individual. There's a lot of sort of confessional narrative out there that captures an aha moment for the writer, but doesn't necessarily invite the reader in. So we remain outside that poem as observer of somebody else's moment. And that is the challenge of the poet, isn't it? To get beyond the self and create that connection with something larger. Could you say more about persona poetry for us?
Just as a sort of definition, right? You're creating a persona and stepping into that persona and trying to bring that persona's vision or crankiness or attitude alive on the page to make some kind of point. It's very similar to creating a character in fiction and entering into that character, often from an I point of view. The character that I created is named Charlene. You have to say her name with like a New York accent or it doesn't really work. Charlene, which I don't do very well. She's middle-aged, and she's sort of reminiscing on what has happened to her in the past, and it allows me to talk a lot about what it's like to go through life as a woman. And the Me Too movement came up in the last several years, and she could talk about that in a very different way than if I talked about it. and she can talk about dying in a way that I can't talk about, because my friends will say, are you considering suicide? And I can say, no, that's Charlene. It allows the poet a layer of distance from what they're doing, which I think is really good, because it allows us to look at the material with a little bit of emotional space. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it makes me think of a lot of classroom moments and it usually happens with poetry, not with prose, where the students don't distinguish the narrative voice from the poet.
Right.
And that creates that opportunity. And I'm wondering too, does it also deepen your understanding of that characters? Like what kind of, it seems maybe paradoxical maybe, but does that also afford opportunities for self-discovery when you're inside Charlene's skin and inside her point of view?
Oh, sure. Right. Because she's just another part of me. So, I mean, she's both at the same time, right? So she's part of me and she's not part of me. And I can speak through her because she's not part of me, and I can put things on her. And then as an object, right, allow myself to look at her and think about what she's thinking and feeling and analyze it in a way that's much simpler than having to think about that subjectively.
Right. And as you said earlier, a lot of the writing process is about figuring things out.
Right.
And so that gives you another voice to figure it out with.
Yeah.
That sounds really like a fun writing process too, to bring another voice into your own conversation. And what's your project poetry about?
What I mean by that is after a while, I ran out of things to whine about, on the page. So I thought, I can't keep doing this. I have to have a focus. And so writing persona poetry was certainly one of those. But also the last two book collections that I've done have both been centered around kind of a single idea. So the first one, Do You Expect Your Art to Answer, is a collection of ekphrastic poems in response to, various museum pieces and artworks that my husband and I saw together. And then the second collection, which was just released this past spring, a year ago, is based around astronomical ideas, concepts I don't really understand very well because I can't do the math, but but as much as I can understand, I've used those as metaphors for the human condition, for, what does it mean to live? What does it mean to die? Do we really matter at all? We're kind of small in this universe, that kind of thing.
Oh, sounds good. I'm just curious about your ekphrastic poetry. What kind of art do you explore in your ekphrastic poetry? There are some particular paintings or objects that might be familiar to our listeners?
Well, some of it will be. There's a piece in there by Picasso from the Picasso Museum in France. There's, oh no, hang on, I can never remember the name of it. It's Symphony in White #1. I think that's what it is. And it's a woman dressed in a white dress with her hair loose down her back, standing on a wolf pelt. And it's Sargent. I love him. We love the Met. And so there are a lot of pieces there from the Met, from the Costume Institute, the Chinese Garden Court, which we love. So if your listeners are familiar with the Met, then a number of those pieces will be familiar to them.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds amazing. So it's not just paintings, it's a whole range of different types of art. And I think ekphrastic poetry is a great way to get beyond the self, and there's that immediate other world that you're stepping into, whatever that work of art is, that is just freeing you from yourself in a way, so that sounds really exciting. I'm curious, when you started reading, I think it's great that you were frustrated in kindergarten that reading wasn't really gonna happen for another year.
That was terrible.
False advertising, I tell you, that school board.
I know.
When you got to unlock text by learning to read, what kind of poetry did you start with, or lyrics did you engage in that sort of spoke to you as a writer?
Well, A.A. Milne brought me to poetry. James, Morrison, Weatherby, George Dupree. Took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. I mean, the rhyme is so great and the character is so arrogant and pretentious and funny, and and I was 7, so I didn't really get the whole patriarchy thing till later. But certainly children's rhymes, my parents read, my great aunt was in publishing with Houghton Mifflin in Boston, and so she would bring home books for us, and so there was lots and lots of language and appreciation for words in my family. But I think that if you can hook kids with that stuff early, right, that doesn't go away. That pleasure is still there.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think Milne is an important one. And my mother was never a big fan of Dr. Seuss, so I didn't see it till I was in school. But the rhyme of it and the nonsense, and it's so interesting that we are enjoying the sounds when we're young, and the sounds,
Yes.
and the musicality of the language, and the meaning keeps unlocking itself for us as we grow with those poems, and it makes me think of my daughter had a love for Mary Poppins, and we watched all the time when she was growing up. And I used to joke that I could do a Marxist critique of the thing. I could do a feminist critique.
That's great.
Yeah, and she was just marching around the living room with the songs, votes for women and all that kind of stuff. It was just the exuberance of the music and the larger messages. They keep speaking to us. You can go back to Shakespeare, and every stage of your life, it's going to tell you something new.
Definitely.
And that's the magic of the poetry. And speaking of the magic of the poetry, could you just talk about your work and how it's affected others?
Yeah, I don't know that I know how it has affected other people unless they tell me. I had a woman come up to me once at the end of a reading and say to me about a poem that I had read, "Oh, thank you. That is exactly how I felt." I think that's one of the most profound connections or moments that I've ever had with a listener. Most of the time they just clap politely and then wait for someone else to get up there. I wrote a poem when I was poet laureate for the retirement of the head of the Arts Commission, who was so supportive of my work when I was laureate. I wrote a couple of poems about the city of Norwalk, which have been, posted here and there. But mostly I don't write for other people. That is fraught with difficulty and challenge that I don't know, I'm not very comfortable with.
I think an interesting phenomenon is the number of writers, the number of open mics, whether they're in person or online, has just proliferated since COVID. I think the Zoom life has kind of expanded access to other people who are writers and want an audience. What do you think compels people to write, or what compels you to write in a world that's full of written stuff? I'm always wondering the question for myself, does the world need another poem? And I think for me, the answer is yes. And I'm just curious, what is the compulsion to write? Do you feel there's a need for audience, or is the writing an end in itself?
Oh, well, teaching students, I'm always on at them about audience. Who's your audience? Who are you writing for? How do you think this is going to impact an audience? And when I was in grad school, it was always, you should imagine your audience and, kind of put demographic information to them. How old are they? Are they male or female? That's never really helped me very much. I don't think I shape it for a particular audience, but I do think about whether or not the words on the page are going to have an impact of some kind for someone who is reading or listening to it. So yes, I think audience is important. And when I do read, because I read at open mics and people invite me to do things, I do choose what I'm going to read based on whether or not I think it will have an impact when it's heard, right? Because some poems are meant to be read on the page. You need the time and the space to absorb from line to line what's going on and to kind of make those connections. And others, it's either simple enough or the image is big enough, right, that it's easier for the reader to kind of capture it all in, or the listener, I'm sorry, to capture it all in that moment. So yeah, I think audience is really important, but I'm not compelled to write because of an audience. I'm compelled to write. I don't know why. And if I knew why, I might stop.
That's great.
You know, during the pandemic, this was really interesting to me and a little off topic, so I'm sorry. But because I teach, everything I did was words. There was no interaction at all. It was email, it was whatever students were doing on the discussion board, it was their assignments. And then to sit down and write more during that time, I just thought, I can't do this. And I started taking photographs. So what compels people to write? I don't know, some desire, some profound desire to be heard, I guess.
Well, it's interesting, you know, some other folks that I've spoken to on the podcast, they talk about writing at 4 o'clock in the morning, writing late at night, and not writing for anybody, but that deep need to maybe figure something out, or it just, the muses are speaking to us. Maybe the ancients just chalked it up to this force they called the muses that come through us and want that message communicated. But and I think what you're saying about what happened to language during the pandemic is such a rich topic, because so much was written. And, you know, for me as a high school teacher, we used a lot of things that allowed kids to audio record, like Flipgrid and things like this. So that alleviated some of the written things, but language became weird because so much of it was email, and you have no context and sometimes a very brief message from somebody. And it was like a New Yorker cartoon I saw on Instagram the other day, a woman sitting on a couch holding her phone, and she says something like, took half a minute to write that, now 3 hours to worry if the tone was okay. You know? But there's just something very strange about what happens to language. It lives by itself, and it wants context. And part of it is who we are, you know, right. And when we deliver the words in person, that's one thing. When it's just words on a page, it's a different game. And I think what you're saying about, will this poem be read in public or will it be read off the page in private? That's a big consideration, you know, because, and some forms are more demanding of thought. Mm-hmm. And what do you say in response to a poem you've never heard before that has you thinking? I was on an open mic up this way with Arts Escape in Southbury a couple weeks ago, and a woman delivered a very powerful poem. And when she was done, we were all in the poem and nobody clapped. And thank God she brought it back to that at the end of the Zoom call, because she wanted to know, was it such a terrible poem that nobody clapped? And it was quite the opposite. We were just so taken by what she had said. We were still with her in those words, you know. It was really, really powerful. So I think what this conversation is making me think about is just how dynamic language is. And when we ask our students to think about audience, to remember, we don't live in your head with you, students, right? You know, and you got to give us enough to live in that thought with you while we're reading it. And that's the difference between a purely confessional piece of writing that doesn't take into consideration a desire to connect with others, versus a poem that goes beyond its author. Powerful considerations. And it's really, I think this conversation for me is very fruitful, and I hope for others as well, because also you're coming at it from the point of view of somebody who reads submissions. And what does that look like? Am I your audience, right? Are you really desirous of connecting with me as your reader?
Right. And have you, I mean, I think less so with the editorial work than with the students. And with students, it can be, I just didn't know what to do, right? But there is also that question of how much time and energy and thought did you put into this, you know? Or did you dash it off and think it was done and didn't consider how each of those words played off of each other or what they were doing? I don't know. The man that I assign at the very beginning of my fiction workshop, he was the writer that said, I write only as far as my headlights can go. I can see what I can see with my headlights, and then and then I have to wait till I get there so that the headlights will go ahead. And who is that? Anyway, he said that it took him, half an hour to write a letter for his daughter, excuse note for his daughter for school for being late. And finally his wife just grabbed it out of his hand, scribbled it and handed it to her and said, go. And he kept rephrasing it, reshaping it and cutting words out. That's not quite what I mean. And
it is very difficult. It is very difficult. And you think about the time and effort and the thought and that goes into writing. And I think the danger with students and with people who don't write is the idea that the thought arrives fully formed.
Yeah.
And somehow the writer is the transcriptionist of this fully formed thought, and everybody has a right to their fully formed thought on the page, and that misses the opportunity to engage other people in the thought process, or to honor the experience that you're trying to capture with the thought it deserves, by asking yourself, are these the words I want? And I had a professor at Western who would tell us, you're responsible for every meaning that word carries when you put it on the page.
That's great.
You didn't want to write a very long poem because, you'd need your lawyer to look it over to make sure. But you think about that, and what that word means to you might not be what it means to me. And all these kinds of things come into the conversation.
By the way, the writer's name is E.L. Doctorow.
It's a super great image to think about in terms of what we're doing as writers.
Well, it helps alleviate panic too, right? I don't know how my story ends. Don't worry, you don't have to know, right? You only have to know as far as the headlights go.
That's right. And then that weird magical thing happens where the story starts to write itself in some ways. The ideas take form. And as you said at the beginning of this conversation, it's a figuring out.
Yeah.
And you have to give yourself the permission to figure it out by turning off the critic in your head and just let it happen. It's that tremendous freedom of the first draft. But you have to rein in that freedom to really have something worth sharing with another human being.
Yeah, for sure.
Laurel, would you share some of your poetry with us so we can hear your poetic voices as well?
Sure. So I thought I would read from my book, Daughter of Sky. And the poem that I'm going to read is called Boxon Mountain. And it has an epigraph, and the epigraph is from the New York Times Science section. All of them are trying to listen to quantum whispers. And the article is In a Russian Mountain Stalking Cosmic Ghosts. Boxon Mountain. All these years, we've looked at stars, falling for patterns of pin-pricked darkness. If only we could stand back far enough to see the whole universe clearly, like one of those pointillist paintings, or a dot matrix Chuck Close that dissolves into nothing when near. What a miracle, the moment when you turn to look back from the doorway and it resolves into itself. If only whispers worked that way. Even right in our ear, they can echo like a wave washing sand, 1,000 particles somersaulting in liquid suspension, like the tumbling of our own blood, synchronized to the pulsing sea and air. All our noise competes with quantum whispers, heartbeats, airplanes, the sizzling out of stars, our own burn wounds hissing. We can't get back far enough into silence for the universe to let us see itself. Perhaps smells or tastes unlock its heart, like the opening of love. Surely, we spend our days oblivious of its knocking, particles streaming through us like light through pain.
Wow. Thank you so much for reading that. That is stunning. I love the way you captured the mystery of the cosmos and the conversation kind of between that and the experience of being alive and the sounds we make.
Yeah, I'm tackling little issues. Like, what am I thinking?
So I love the epigraph and the reference to the New York Times. Can you just say something about the creative process? Like how did that come together for you to like how did you put all that together?
Well, the book came about partly, my father was an airline pilot. And so, flying is a fabulous metaphor, and that identity that he had and the travel that we got to do as a result of that is very much part of who I am. And he died just before the pandemic started, literally like a month. And so a lot of these poems are dealing with my complicated relationship with him and using those metaphors of sky and astronomy, and also sort of our mythology around it, UFOs and things like that, as a way to think about that relationship, and also to think about, death and what happens to us. And is there a God? I mean, in a multiverse, is there a God? If there is a God, is that a personal God? Like, how can he find us in the multiverse? Things like that, little things. And so, because I am an English teacher and not an astronomer, I had to do a lot of research and reading. And every time I came across something that I thought was interesting, I would, take a little piece of it and try to create a poem from it. And so this particular collection has quite a few pieces with epigraphs in it from that research.
I just love the kind of the marrying of the nonfiction with the exploration that you're doing, and just the poetry that emerges from paying attention to the world and looking around you and reading. What's next for you, Laurel, in your writing journey?
Well, what I've been working on is a mixed genre collection. I teach it, and we did a bit of that in grad school, and I'm interested in it, and I'm not quite sure I can do it, right? So there's the challenge. That's the fun part. And so I am mixing poetry with the photography that I started to do during the pandemic, and some kind of short, more meditative essay-like pieces. And so I've got about 35 pages of that I have been working on. So that's what's next. We'll see if I can pull it off.
That's great. Do you have a deadline for yourself, or is it the headlights? You'll get there.
It's the headlights. Definitely the headlights. I have enough for a chapbook length collection, and I'm not sure that I will find someone willing to take that short with the photographs and everything. So I don't know. It's with my writing group at the moment, and we'll see what they have to say.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for People and Their Poems today, Laurel. And again, if people want to learn more about your work, they can go to laurelpeterson.com and look forward to seeing your work and what's ahead for you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.